The auctioneer's gavel crashed down on the wooden platform with the finality of a coffin lid, silencing the murmurs of the crowd gathered in truth or consequences. New Mexico on that sweltering July afternoon in 1876. Victoria Rowland stood with her chin raised, her dark eyes burning with unshed tears as the townspeople she had once called friends and neighbors stared at her like she was nothing more than livestock being sold to the highest bidder. $500, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the dusty town square. Do I hear 600 for Mrs. Rowland, a fine woman capable of cooking, cleaning, sewing, all the womanly arts? Her late husband's debts must be satisfied. The bank will accept no less. Victoria bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. 3 months ago, she had been the respected wife of a promising businessman. Now, at 26, she was a widow being auctioned off to pay Harold Rowland's gambling debts she hadn't known existed until the day after they'd put him in the ground. 600, called a gruff voice from the back. Victoria's stomach turned as she recognized Everett Palmer, the owner of the saloon on the edge of town. His reputation with women was notorious, and the thought of being bound to him made her want to retch. 650, countered another voice, this one belonging to the elderly banker who held her husband's debts. 700, Palmer shot back. The crowd buzzed with excitement. Victoria had never felt more humiliated in her life. She thought of the small cabin she had kept so carefully, the garden she had tended, the life she had built, all gone now, seized by the bank the week before. 800, came a new voice, deep and steady. The crowd parted, revealing a tall stranger at the back. He stepped forward, and Victoria found herself looking at perhaps the most striking man she'd ever seen. Broad-shouldered and sun-bronzed, he moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the saddle. His clothes were travel-worn but of good quality, and though he wore a gun belt, there was something different about him, something that set him apart from the usual rough elements that passed through town. $800 from the stranger, the auctioneer announced, excitement edging his voice at the unexpected bid. 900, Palmer growled, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. The stranger stepped forward again, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he approached the platform. $1,000, he said, his voice carrying clearly. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. In gold. A hush fell over the crowd. $1,000 was far more than Victoria was worth in the cruel calculation of the auction. The auctioneer looked to Palmer, who scowled but said nothing. The banker's expression had turned from predatory to calculating. Going once, the auctioneer called, scanning the crowd. Going twice. He paused dramatically. Sold to the gentleman for $1,000. Victoria felt dizzy with relief that she would not belong to Palmer, but her heart pounded with fear of what this stranger might expect from her. She was led down from the platform as the stranger approached and handed over his payment to the bank representative. Only when he turned to her did she see his eyes, clearly a startling blue against his tanned skin, intelligent and somehow kind, though his expression remained inscrutable. "Madam," he said with a slight tip of his hat, "the name's Blake Buchanan." "Victoria Rowland," she replied automatically, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said. Then, to her astonishment, he added, "You're free to go, Mrs. Rowland." Victoria stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon, you're free," he repeated. "I've paid your husband's debts. You owe me nothing." The banker stepped forward, frowning. "Now see here, Mr. Buchanan. The law clearly states that in cases like these, the law," Blake interrupted, "states that the debts must be paid." "They have been. I've purchased nothing more than Mrs. Rowland's freedom." The banker sputtered, but Blake turned away from him, addressing Victoria directly. "Do you have somewhere to go, Mrs. Rowland?" Victoria's mind raced. Her home was gone. Her friends, if they could be called that after their behavior today, had turned their backs on her. "No," she admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice. Blake nodded as if he had expected this answer. "There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson at the edge of town. She's a good woman. I've arranged for a room for you there, paid for 3 months in advance. Victoria was speechless. Before she could collect herself enough to thank him, Blake Buchanan tipped his hat once more, turned, and began walking toward the livery stable where his horse was presumably kept. "Wait," Victoria called, finding her voice at last. She hurried after him, acutely aware of the stares following her. "Mr. Buchanan, why would you do this? You don't know me." He paused, looking back at her with those remarkable eyes. Something flickered across his face, some emotion she couldn't identify. "Let's just say I've seen enough injustice in this world, Mrs. Rowland. I didn't care to see more today." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "No one should be treated like property." Before she could respond, he continued walking. Victoria stood rooted to the spot, watching as he disappeared around the corner. Something told her that his statement came from personal experience, but she had no way of knowing what demons drove this mysterious man. That evening, Victoria found herself in a small but clean room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The older woman had welcomed her without judgment, simply saying, "Any friend of Blake Buchanan's is welcome here." "Is he a friend of yours?" Victoria asked, surprised. "Not exactly," Mrs. Henderson replied. "He stayed here last year when he was passing through. Paid double his rate and fixed my leaking roof before he left. Said if he ever sent anyone my way to take good care of them." She smiled kindly. "Looks like you're the first." Victoria sat on the edge of the narrow bed, fingering the worn quilt. "I don't understand why he would help me." "Some men still have honor," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "Now, supper's at 6. You look like you could use a good meal." The next morning, Victoria woke to the sound of birds and distant cattle. For a moment, she forgot the events of the previous day, but reality quickly crashed down upon her. She was a widow, penniless, dependent on the inexplicable charity of a stranger. After dressing in one of the 2 dresses she'd been allowed to keep, the bank had seized nearly everything else. Victoria made her way downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was already cooking breakfast, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the small house. "Good morning, dear," the older woman greeted her. "Sleep well as could be expected," Victoria replied honestly. Mrs. Henderson nodded understandingly. "There's coffee ready. And I've got something for you." She wiped her hands on her apron and retrieved an envelope from a shelf. "Mr. Buchanan left this before he rode out last night." Victoria's heart skipped. "He's gone," said he had business elsewhere, Mrs. Henderson confirmed, handing over the envelope. Victoria opened it with slightly trembling fingers. Inside was a folded letter and several banknotes, more money than she had seen in months. The letter was brief. "Mrs. Rowland, this should help you get established. It's not charity, but what you're owed after your property was unfairly seized. The money is yours to use as you see fit." Blake Buchanan. Victoria stared at the note in disbelief. "I don't understand," she murmured. "Why would he do this?" "Some questions don't have easy answers," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "But I suggest you take the blessing you've been given and make something of it." Over the following days, Victoria did just that. She purchased fabric and began taking in sewing, something she had always excelled at. Mrs. Henderson introduced her to several respectable ladies in town who commissioned dresses and mending, but every night as she lay in bed, Victoria found her thoughts turning to Blake Buchanan. Who was he? What drove him to such generosity? And why had he left so abruptly, without giving her a real chance to thank him? 2 weeks after the auction, Victoria was returning from delivering a mended shirt to the general store when she overheard 2 men talking outside the saloon. "Heard Buchanan's back," one said, lighting a cigarette. "The bounty hunter," the other replied. "Thought he'd moved on. Nope. Brought in the Delaney brothers yesterday. They've got him locked up over in Silver City now. Word is he's staying at the old Mitchell place outside town." Victoria's heart raced. A bounty hunter. That explained the gun, the confident bearing. But it didn't explain his kindness to her. Without fully thinking through her decision, Victoria found herself at the livery stable an hour later, renting a gentle mare. She had never been much of a horsewoman, but she knew the way to the Mitchell homestead. It was about 3 miles outside of town, abandoned after old Jim Mitchell had died the previous winter. The ride took her longer than she expected, and the sun was beginning to set by the time she spotted the small cabin nestled against a backdrop of cottonwoods. Smoke rose from the chimney, confirming someone was indeed there. Victoria dismounted awkwardly and tied her horse to a post. As she approached the cabin, the door suddenly opened and Blake Buchanan stood framed in the doorway, his hand hovering near his gun. His expression changed from wariness to surprise when he recognized her. "Mrs. Rowland," he said, dropping his hand, "is everything all right?" Victoria suddenly felt foolish. What was she doing here, chasing after a man she barely knew? I heard you were back in the area," she said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness." The wariness returned to his face, but he nodded and stepped aside. "You'd better come in, it's getting dark." The interior of the cabin was Spartan but neat. A small fire burned in the hearth and the table was covered with papers and what looked like wanted posters. Blake quickly gathered them up, clearing a space. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. "Yes, thank you," Victoria replied, taking the seat he offered. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight gray at his temples that she hadn't noticed before. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s. As he prepared the coffee, Victoria gathered her courage. "Mr. Buchanan, I need to understand why you helped me. The money you left, it's far too much. I can't accept it without knowing why." Blake was silent for a long moment, his back to her as he poured the coffee. When he finally turned and set a cup before her, his expression was guarded. "My reasons are my own, Mrs. Rowland," he said, "but I assure you the money is rightfully yours." "You don't know me," she persisted. "I could be a terrible person." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Are you?" "No," she said honestly. "But neither am I the helpless creature you seem to think I am." He studied her, those blue eyes seeming to look into her soul. "I never thought you were helpless," he said finally. "Just in need of a fair chance." Victoria sipped her coffee, finding it surprisingly good. "I heard you're a bounty hunter." Blake nodded, his expression neutral. "That's right. It seems an unusual profession for a man with such philanthropic tendencies." He actually chuckled at that. "I only go after men who deserve it, Mrs. Rowland, men who have done real harm." "Like the Delaney brothers," his eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been asking about me. People talk," she said simply. "Especially when a mysterious stranger buys a woman's freedom and then disappears." Blake leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "The Delaneys robbed a stagecoach last month, shot the driver and a passenger. They deserved what they got." "And what about my husband's creditors? Did they deserve what they got?" His expression hardened slightly. "Your husband's debts were inflated. I made inquiries. The interest they charged was criminal and the seizure of your property was premature. They took advantage of a widow." Victoria was startled by this information. "How do you know all this?" "It's my job to know things about people," he said simply, "to read situations." Night had fallen completely now, and Victoria suddenly realized the impropriety of her position alone in a cabin with a man she barely knew, miles from town. "I should go," she said, rising. "It's late." Blake stood as well. "I'll ride with you back to town. These roads aren't safe at night." "I don't need an escort," Victoria said, though the thought of riding alone in the dark did unnerve her. "Indulge me," he said, already reaching for his hat and coat. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clop of hooves and the night creatures stirring in the brush. Victoria found herself studying Blake's profile in the moonlight, strong and somehow lonely. "Will you stay in truth or consequences long?" she asked eventually. "No," he replied. "I move on when the job's done." "And is it done, I mean?" Blake was quiet for a moment. "Not quite. There's one more matter to settle." They reached the edge of town, and Blake escorted her all the way to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. As Victoria dismounted, their hands briefly touched, sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Buchanan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Blake," he corrected her softly. "My name is Blake." "Then you must call me Victoria," he nodded, something shifting in his eyes. "Good night, Victoria." As she watched him ride away, Victoria realized she was more intrigued than ever by the mysterious bounty hunter. The next morning, Truth or Consequences was buzzing with news. Everett Palmer had been arrested in the night, charged with running an illegal gambling operation and extortion. The evidence had apparently been delivered anonymously to the sheriff, evidence that also implicated the banker in a scheme to defraud widows and other vulnerable citizens of their property. Victoria could hardly believe it when Mrs. Henderson told her the news over breakfast. "And that's not all," the landlady continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "They say many of the seized properties will be returned to their rightful owners, including yours, Mrs. Rowland." Victoria's hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped her coffee cup. "My home," Mrs. Henderson nodded. "The sheriff wants to see you this morning, something about paperwork." 2 hours later, Victoria stood in her small cabin at the edge of town, scarcely able to believe it was hers again. The furniture was still there, the garden overgrown but salvageable. Even her husband's books and her mother's china had been returned. She knew without being told who was responsible for this miracle. What she didn't understand was why, that evening, a soft knock at her door revealed Blake Buchanan, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "May I come in?" he asked. Victoria stepped aside wordlessly, her heart hammering in her chest. Once inside, Blake looked around the small cabin, nodding with approval. "It's a good place," he said. "Sturdy." "You did this," Victoria said, finding her voice at last. "You brought down Palmer and the banker." Blake shrugged. "They were criminals, I just brought the evidence to light." "Why?" Victoria asked, moving closer to him. "Why go to such lengths for me? And don't tell me again that your reasons are your own. I deserve the truth." Blake's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw real emotion there, a vulnerability that belied his strong exterior. "My sister," he said softly. "She was widowed young like you, fell victim to men like Palmer. By the time I found out what had happened, she had." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. She saw no way out. Victoria's heart ached for him, for the pain she could see etched in the lines of his face. "I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said, "but when I rode into town and saw the notice about the auction. When I saw you standing there with your head held high despite everything, I couldn't ride away. So I reminded you of your sister," Victoria said, trying to understand. Blake shook his head slowly. "No, you reminded me that there are still things in this world worth fighting for." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words and feelings. Victoria was acutely aware of his presence, of the strength and kindness that radiated from him. "When will you leave?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Tomorrow," he said. "I have a job waiting in Arizona territory." Victoria nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Will you at least stay for supper? It's the least I can do to thank you." Blake hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." As Victoria busied herself preparing a simple meal, Blake moved about the cabin, examining the books on the shelf, the faded daguerreotype of her parents on the mantel. "You're well read," he observed, running his fingers over the spines of the books. "My father was a schoolteacher," Victoria explained. "He believed education was important for daughters as well as sons." "A wise man," Blake commented. They ate by lamplight, talking of small things, at first the weather, the town, Blake's travels. But as the evening wore on, the conversation deepened. Victoria told him about her marriage to Harold, a kind but restless man who had never been content with what they had. Blake spoke of his years tracking outlaws across the frontier, of the loneliness of the trail, but also the satisfaction of bringing justice to lawless places. "Don't you ever want to settle down?" Victoria asked as she poured more coffee. Blake's eyes met hers across the table. "I used to think I wasn't made for it," he said thoughtfully. "The quiet life. And now I'm not so sure." The moment hung between them, full of possibilities neither dared to speak aloud. When Blake finally rose to leave, Victoria walked him to the door. On the threshold, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Victoria," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "I want you to know that what I did, it wasn't just about my sister or about righting a wrong. There was something about you, something I can't quite explain." Victoria's heart pounded as he reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I think I understand," she whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. "Good night, Victoria," he said softly. "I wish you all the happiness in the world." And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond her door. Victoria barely slept that night, her mind filled with thoughts of Blake Buchanan, of his kindness and strength, of the way his eyes seemed to see into her soul. By dawn, she had made a decision. Dressing quickly, Victoria hurried to the livery stable. The owner was just opening up for the day. "Morning, Mrs. Rowland," he greeted her. "What brings you out so early, Mr. Buchanan?" Victoria said breathlessly. "Has he left yet?" The liveryman shook his head. "Not yet. Paid for his horse to be ready at 8. Should be here any minute now." Victoria paced anxiously, ignoring the curious looks from the few early risers on the street. When Blake finally appeared, leading his saddled horse, he stopped short at the sight of her. "Victoria," he said, surprise evident in his voice, "what are you doing here?" She moved toward him, gathering all her courage. "I couldn't let you leave without telling you something." Blake waited, his expression guarded yet somehow hopeful. "You said last night that something about me affected you," Victoria continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "Well, something about you has affected me too. In all my life, I've never met a man with your sense of justice, your kindness, your—" She faltered, searching for words. "Victoria," Blake said softly, stepping closer. "I know you have your work, your life on the trail," she pressed on. "I'm not asking you to change that, but I am asking if truth or consequences might become a place you return to, a place where someone is waiting for you." Blake was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hands in his. "I've spent 10 years drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots," he said. "I told myself it was the work, the need to bring criminals to justice. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what?" Victoria asked. "Of caring too much, of having something to lose." His grip tightened on her hands. "But when I saw you on that auction platform, something changed. For the first time in years, I wanted to stay." Victoria's heart soared at his words. "Then stay," she whispered, "or go if you must, but come back to me." Blake released her hands, but only to cup her face gently between his palms. "Are you sure? My life isn't easy. There are men who would seek revenge. I'm not afraid," Victoria interrupted. "Not anymore." The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, then deepening with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally parted, breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I have to go to Arizona," he said. "There's a man there who's hurt too many innocent people." "But I'll come back, Victoria, I promise you that." "I'll be here," she replied, her heart full. "However long it takes." 3 weeks later, Victoria was tending her garden when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She straightened, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun, her heart leaping at the familiar silhouette of a rider coming down the road. Blake Buchanan dismounted in front of her cabin, his face breaking into a rare, full smile at the sight of her. "You came back," Victoria said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "I told you I would," he replied, closing the distance between them in a few long strides. "And I'm staying this time." "What about your work?" she asked as his arms encircled her waist. "I've decided to make a change," he said. "The new marshal in Silver City offered me a deputy position. It's steady work, close enough to ride home most nights." "Home," Victoria repeated, savoring the word. "If you'll have me," Blake said, suddenly serious. "Victoria Rowland, I've traveled across this country, seen its wonders and its darkness, but nothing has ever felt like coming home until I met you." Victoria reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. "I'll have you, Blake Buchanan, for as long as you'll stay." Their life together began that day not without challenges, but filled with a love that had sparked in the most unlikely of circumstances. Blake continued to work for justice, but now he had a home to return to, a place of peace in a wild land. Over the years, truth or consequences would come to know them as fixtures of the community, the skilled seamstress, and the former bounty hunter who had found each other when hope seemed lost. Their story became something of a legend in the small town, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. how a widow had stood proud on an auction block, and how a stranger with eyes the color of the desert sky had seen her worth when no one else would. 2 years after Blake's return, Victoria gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after Blake's father. 3 years later came a daughter, Elizabeth. Their home, once so empty and haunted by the ghost of Victoria's first husband, filled with laughter and love. On warm evenings, they would sit together on the porch Blake had built, watching the sunset paint the desert in golds and crimsons, their children playing in the yard. "Do you ever miss it?" Victoria asked him once. "The open trail, the freedom." Blake took her hand, running his thumb across her knuckles in the gentle way he had. "Freedom is different things to different people," he said thoughtfully. "For some, it's the absence of ties. For me, it turned out to be this you, our children, this home we've made." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never thought possible on that terrible day when she stood to be auctioned like property. "I'm glad you bought my freedom," she murmured. "I'm glad you showed me what freedom really means," he replied, kissing the top of her head. And as the stars appeared one by one in the vast New Mexico sky, they sat together in the quiet warmth of a love that had begun with an act of kindness and grown into something that would last a lifetime.